Work. Sometimes it feels like our entire lives are based around it. When we are young, we go to good schools, get good grades, in order to get a good job. Then we spend decades of our lives behind a desk, in a meeting, or striving for the next promotion. But why? In the 1950s, economist Franco Modigliani of MIT came up with a theory, the life cycle theory. He suggested that as humans, we follow a trend of consumption, that we work hard to build wealth in our early adult to late adult lives, so that when we retire, we can spend the rest of our days living a life of luxury. And at first, this sounds great, but when we take a closer look, the data says something different. Moreover, studies in the United States and the United Kingdom find that consumption is not smooth over people's lifetimes, and it doesn't peak in retirement. Instead, it tends to rise through middle age and then fall after retirement. So how can we explain this trend? Well, Laurence Levin in 1989 released his paper on the behavioral life cycle theory and begins to give us a better explanation. Let's take a look. Levin begins his research by noting the major differences between the conventional life cycle theory and the behavioral life cycle theory. He found that the biggest difference between the two models was an individual's marginal propensity to consume, or their MPC. In conventional life cycle theory, an increase in wealth or an increase in income should equally affect consumption. However, in the behavioral model, spending should be very sensitive to income and much less sensitive to wealth. So before we go any further, let's think about what this means. I'm going to ask you this question. How does your spending change relative to an increase in income or an increase in wealth? So if you were to get a $10,000 raise at work, would you spend more? Now let's say instead of getting a raise, your home value increased by $10,000. Now would you spend more? Well, conventional life cycle theory would suggest that either way, whether you got the raise or your home increased in value, your MPC should increase. However, the behavioral model suggests that maybe there are some psychological or behavioral components that could modify the life cycle theory and make it more accurate. So to test his hypothesis, Levin conducts 3 different tests. The first test is what we just discussed. Is there a difference between the marginal propensity to consume from income and the marginal propensity to consume from wealth? The second test compares the MPCs of different assets. If individuals are conventional life cycle savers, then the MPCs of the different assets should be equal. In other words, assets should be perfect substitutes. The third test is a test for liquidity constraints. The idea behind this test is that in a conventional life cycle model, liquidity constraints are externally imposed by market imperfections which limit the ability to borrow against future income. Whereas in the behavioral life cycle model, liquidity constraints may also be internally imposed by the consumer. The testable difference between internal and external liquidity constraints is that if the constraint is external, the value of an illiquid asset will affect consumption as long as the other more liquid assets are still being held. But they will cease to affect consumption when those more liquid assets are depleted, since then the liquidity constraint will be binding. To test these theories, he gathered data from the Longitudinal Retirement History Survey. This was a survey done between 1969 and 1979 with 11,000 household heads varying in age between 57 to 62 when the survey started. They repeated the survey every 2 years starting in 1969 and concluding in 1979, and so this made for 6 waves of data. The data included detailed information on family status, wealth, Social Security, income, and expenditures. Specifically, he used 8 different expenditure categories. The categories were food eaten at home, food eaten out, charitable contributions, dues to clubs, it was the 60s and 70s, entertainment, gifts, transportation, and vacations. So taking this data and knowing what we're testing for, let's look at the results. The first result was that spending seems to be very sensitive to changes in income, but much less sensitive to changes in wealth. Specifically, for every dollar increased of income, 42 cents of that was spent. However, for every dollar increase in wealth, only 2 cents was spent. If the conventional life cycle theory were to hold, then receiving a dollar of permanent income should change consumption just as much as receiving an extra amount of wealth equal to the present value of that dollar. As we can clearly see that that's not the case, there is strong evidence against the conventional life cycle theory. The second major result was that the relation between wealth and consumption reveals a pattern in which individuals treat assets as being not fungible. This means that assets were not valued equally. And this, again, goes directly against the conventional life cycle theory. So we've seen plenty of evidence against the conventional life cycle theory, but what evidence was there for the behavioral life cycle theory? Well, the liquidity constraints affect consumption not as the conventional model predicts, but in a manner consistent with the existence of either financial or psychological transaction costs. The effect of these constraints may also be evidence of a behavioral bequest motive. So finally, the amount spent on a particular good seems to depend not only on the individual's total resources, but also on how those resources are split between different assets. Overall, the patterns in the data provide enough evidence in favor of the behavioral life cycle model. Levin concludes by stating that he believes the problem of self-control is the main problem in the standard life cycle framework. He says that simple idea provides an accurate explanation of the patterns he found in his data. So maybe if you and I could exercise a little more self-control, we can still have the retirement of luxury that we've all dreamed of.